The year was 37 CE, and the city of marble was alive with jubilation. Rome believed it had finally found redemption in the form of a young man with soft eyes and a charming smile. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, better known by the childhood nickname Caligula, Little Boots. To the masses, he was the son of the heroic Germanicus, the boy who had walked through the legion's camps adored by soldiers. To the Senate, he was a symbol of stability after years of tyranny under Emperor Tiberius. To everyone, he was hope itself. For 100 days, the empire celebrated his coronation. Golden confetti rained over the forum, prison gates opened, taxes were cut. Gladiators fought not for blood but for spectacle. The streets glowed at night with torches and song. Even the weary senators, men who had learned to live in fear of their own shadows, dared to exhale. It seemed as if Rome's golden age had returned. Caligula walked among his people like a god disguised as a man. He embraced beggars, dined with soldiers, and smiled at children who sang his name. The world saw kindness, generosity, and youth wrapped in royal silk. They called him the miracle of Rome. But behind that radiant mask was something else, something watching, calculating, learning. From his earliest years, he had lived in the serpent's nest of imperial politics. He had seen his mother Agrippina the Elder dragged into exile, his brothers executed or starved to death. He had dined beside his great-uncle Tiberius on the island of Capri, surrounded by whispered cruelty, learning that survival in Rome required performance. Every smile was armor, every gesture strategy. Now with the laurel crown upon his brow, Caligula finally stood above the men who had murdered his blood. And though Rome saw a savior, he saw a stage. The Senate chambers were no longer halls of law, but theaters where he could test his power. The palace corridors, no longer symbols of glory, became veins of control through which he would send his venom. As the celebration lights faded and the cheers grew distant, the new emperor's grin lingered, cold, polished, deliberate. Rome had placed its faith in his smile, never realizing it was the last mercy they would ever see. For that smile would not save Rome, it would devour it. The cheers that once echoed through Rome began to fade into whispers. It was the autumn of 37 CE, when the miracle emperor, the smiling savior of Rome, collapsed in his chamber. The fever struck fast and mercilessly. His skin burned hotter than the oil lamps that flickered beside his bed. He screamed in delirium, calling out to gods that no one could see. Servants fled. Physicians gathered in trembling silence. For weeks Caligula hovered between life and death. He raved that Jupiter had spoken to him, that thunder itself had whispered divine secrets in his ear. His attendants swore they saw him rise in the middle of the night, eyes blazing, muttering in languages unknown to Rome. Priests slaughtered animals in endless sacrifice. Mothers cut their hair in mourning. Men vowed their own lives if the emperor might be spared. The empire held its breath, terrified to imagine Rome without him. And then he opened his eyes. The man who awoke was not the one who had fallen ill. His gaze no longer carried warmth or laughter. His pupils were wide, black, predatory, like an animal seeing in the dark. When he spoke, his voice was soft, slow, almost reverent, but it carried the weight of command. Within days, he issued his first order. Every statue of every god in Rome must have its head replaced, with his own likeness. Temples became workshops for sculptors, carving the emperor's face into divine marble. Jupiter, Apollo, and Mars all were remade into Caligula. The Senate called it blasphemy in private, but in public they bowed. At night, he wandered the palace gardens naked, his skin streaked with dirt, his lips moving in frantic prayer to the moon. Guards followed at a distance, afraid to interrupt. Sometimes he dug into the earth with his bare hands, whispering that he was planting the destiny of Rome. But what he planted was something else entirely. A seed that would take root in the empire's veins, growing into a machine of organized terror. Behind the palace walls, new orders appeared, records of names, households, bloodlines. He began reshaping the empire not with swords, but with decrees, each one colder than the last. The man who once smiled at children now studied the anatomy of fear. Rome had begged the heavens to spare him, and the heavens had listened. Only now they would learn that some prayers should never be answered. It began not in the Senate, nor on the battlefield, but inside the emperor's own home. After his illness, Caligula no longer looked at his family as blood, but as extensions of his divine image. His three sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, became the first victims of his transformation. The palace servants whispered that the emperor no longer prayed to the gods. He believed he was one, and to prove it, he made his household his temple. Among them, Drusilla was his chosen companion. He called her My Diana, goddess of the moon. At festivals and parades, she sat beside him dressed in translucent silks, reserved only for empresses. Senators were ordered to bow to her, priests to bless her as divine consort. What had once been whispers of impropriety now became ritual, sanctioned, public and sacred. But divinity in Caligula's world was fragile. In 38 CE, Drusilla fell ill and died suddenly. The emperor's grief shook the empire like an earthquake. He declared her a goddess, Diva Drusilla, and commanded that all of Rome mourn as if the sun itself had been extinguished. No one was allowed to laugh, sing, or even bathe. Markets closed. Temples burned incense from dusk till dawn. The city fell into silence. Those who dared smile were executed for offending the goddess. Caligula himself wandered the palace draped in black, clutching Drusilla's ring, his voice echoing through marble halls like a funeral hymn. But what burned inside him was not love, it was rage. Rage that death had taken what he believed belonged only to him. His devotion twisted into something darker, ownership. He began to speak of purity, of bloodlines, of how Rome's nobility had grown weak. And soon his obsession shifted. From the sister he lost to the daughters and wives of the men who served him. He claimed he would restore divine vitality to the empire. In truth, he was building the foundations of a machine, one that turned desire into control, humiliation into law. The senators who once celebrated his coronation now avoided his gaze. The same streets that had once shouted his name now whispered it in fear. In the emperor's mind, Drusilla had not died. She had become a spirit that watched and approved as her brother began reshaping Rome into a theater of devotion and degradation. And beneath that divine smile, Caligula was preparing to make the entire empire kneel before his new religion, the worship of his madness. By the year 39 CE, the palace no longer belonged to Rome. It belonged to the gods Caligula had created in his own image. What had once been the seat of the empire became something far darker, the temple of divine service. He stripped the marble corridors of their banners and replaced them with veils of crimson silk. Incense drifted through the air, masking the stench of fear. The same halls that once echoed with debates about law and justice now carried the low hum of prayers not to Jupiter or Venus, but to Caligula himself. He redesigned the palace into a hierarchy of ritual chambers. The room of Jupiter, his personal sanctuary, was a stage where he sat on a gilded throne draped in white and gold, playing God before trembling citizens. Here he bestowed favor through acts that mocked divinity. The chamber of Venus was reserved for noble women. They were ordered to reenact the sacred myths of love and fertility before the emperor and his priests. What had once been poetic became perverse. Ritual became spectacle. The women wore transparent Syrian silk, chosen not for modesty but to humiliate. And deepest within the palace stood the hall of Priapus, a theater of degradation. Men of rank and their families were summoned to witness the emperor's lessons on divine pleasure. The screams that echoed from that marble hall were said to sound like hymns to the gods. Everything was recorded. Nothing escaped the imperial archive. Each violation had a number, each victim a line in a ledger. The emperor's secretaries documented it all: name, social rank, duration, degree of cooperation. Even the payments were neatly itemized, as if they were ordinary taxes. 16 sesterces for a knight's wife, 2,000 for his virgin daughter, 5,000 if both were demanded, at once. The money did not disappear into private pockets, it flowed directly into the imperial treasury under the label voluntary contributions to the state. And through this ledger, Caligula performed his most terrifying miracle. He turned sin into bureaucracy. The empire's moral decay was now a system. Clerks, guards, and priests all played their part, each able to claim innocence because they were just following procedure. No sword, no war, no invasion had ever given Rome such obedience. For the first time, depravity had become a public institution, the machinery of divine corruption, and at its center, surrounded by marble and gold, sat Caligula, smiling softly, watching the empire kneel before the god he believed himself to be. What Caligula built was not chaos, it was order. A terrible, deliberate hierarchy dressed in the language of faith. At the top were the high priestesses, the wives of Rome's senators, draped in sheer silks so delicate that they shimmered like mist under torchlight. They were commanded to perform rituals on cue, their movements choreographed like sacred dances. Around them, scribes stood ready with wax tablets, recording every gesture, every word, as if the emperor's pleasure were divine scripture. Below them came the daughters, girls barely 12, told they were chosen for holy instruction. They learned not prayers but obedience. They were taught how to walk, how to smile, how to appear devoted before the god who ruled their fate. Caligula's physicians became the new priests of this cult. In marble chambers they inspected women as farmers might inspect their flocks. They measured hips, recorded pulse rates, tested for fertility, and documented resilience. The emperor himself sometimes stood beside them, watching silently, his expression calm, almost scholarly. Those who met his secret standards were selected. Their purpose was simple: to bear imperial children. These infants, born in secrecy, were destined to serve the palace. They would never know their mothers or fathers, only the name of the god emperor who created them. Scribes recorded everything in the imperial ledgers. Each birth received a mark, each miscarriage a code, each death an emblem. Even the aborted fetuses were not erased from the records. They were listed as sacrifices to the divine order. The empire's most powerful men saw their own blood turned into a commodity. Yet they said nothing. The line between worship and enslavement had dissolved. To defy Caligula was to defy the god he claimed to be. Servants whispered that the emperor visited the nursery halls at night, standing over rows of cradles like a priest at an altar, murmuring blessings or perhaps curses. Some said he believed these children would one day form a race of perfect beings, loyal only to him. But there was nothing divine in what he had created. It was a breeding ground for despair, a place where Rome's future was written not in glory, but in ledgers of blood. And through it all, the city remained silent. The temples still burned incense, the Senate still bowed, and the people still called him God. Because by now Rome no longer knew where worship ended and slavery began. By now depravity had ceased to hide in the shadows. It had become spectacle. Every full moon Caligula transformed his private amphitheater into a pagan temple, a place he called the lunar fertility grounds. Its marble walls were veiled in silk, the air thick with incense and fear. Senators sat in their togas upon tiered seats, pretending composure while beneath them. Their wives and daughters were led into the arena. The ceremonies were staged with precision. Caligula sat high above the floor on a gilded throne, a staff in his hand carved with obscene symbols of power. He would raise it to dictate the rhythm of the night, assigning partners, positions, and durations, like a conductor leading an orchestra of suffering. Gladiators, Nubian captives, and slaves were summoned to perform before the crowd. Even animals were paraded through the arena, tamed lions and mastiffs trained to terrify, not kill. It was not chaos. It was choreography. Scribes lined the edge of the stage, recording everything with the accuracy of tax collectors, names, times, and the emperor's remarks. Pregnancies were noted in the margins. Each act, no matter how obscene, was logged as ritual fulfillment. The audience sat frozen. Laughter was forbidden, yet silence felt like complicity. When it was over, Caligula would rise, declare the rites complete, and bless the crowd with words that turned atrocity into devotion. Then the senators would applaud, softly, fearfully, as if clapping for a god. But beyond the arena, the emperor's madness had birthed something even darker: an economy. Apothecaries brewed ointments and abortive mixtures, selling them at prices that only the desperate could pay. Tutors were hired to teach victims how to perform compliance, to smile on command, to suppress trembling, to appear pleased before the emperor's gaze. Priests, once guardians of virtue, now blessed the ceremonies as divine unions. Even the empire's merchants prospered. Silk traders, perfumers, sculptors, all profited from the pageantry of corruption. Sin had become commerce, and commerce ensured that cruelty endured. Each full moon the amphitheater glowed like an altar. And above it all sat Caligula, smiling faintly, eyes reflecting torchlight, watching as his empire learned to worship the pain it could no longer feel. For in Rome now, suffering was not hidden. It was performed. And the audience, the senators, the priests, the merchants, were no longer witnesses. They were participants in the emperor's grand design, a theatre where agony itself was divine. By the year 40 CE, resistance in Rome had become a death sentence. Caligula's power no longer needed soldiers. It was enforced by terror itself. Some women tried to end their suffering. They drank poison from temple gardens or slashed their faces with shards of glass, hoping disfigurement would spare them from the emperor's selection. None succeeded. The imperial physicians, those same men once sworn to heal, restored the victims with cold precision, patching flesh, stitching wounds, and returning them to service. Their reward for defiance was not death, but survival. Broken, scarred, and made to serve again, others endured even worse. Mothers were ordered to watch their daughters taken from them, then commanded to take their place in the next ceremony. Caligula called it the purification of love. To him, family was a weakness that needed cleansing, a loyalty greater than worship to his name. In the Senate, fear ruled with absolute authority. The nobles who once shaped the laws of the empire were now prisoners of their own silence. Senator Cornelius, a man of courage, made the fatal mistake of defiance. When ordered to surrender his wife, Libya, to the imperial temple, he refused. For a single night, he was celebrated in whispers as a hero. By morning, that hope was gone. His 8-year-old son was found alive on the marble steps of the Senate, mutilated, bleeding, with a message carved into his flesh. Obedience is love. The horror silenced every whisper in Rome. That afternoon, Cornelius delivered his wife to the palace himself. No one ever saw him speak again. Beneath the palace, the emperor's clerks continued their endless work. Thousands of scrolls filled the archive chambers, names, ages, durations, and the status of each victim. Every act was documented, every wound categorized, every loss recorded like a line item in the empire's budget. The bureaucrats moved with mechanical calm, as if cruelty were just another branch of administration. There were no screams left in Rome now, only the scratching of quills. The empire had learned that silence was safer than virtue. Priests preached devotion. Senators signed decrees. The people bowed and pretended not to see the smoke rising from the palace at night. And above them all, Caligula sat on his throne, of gold and marble, watching his empire kneel. Not out of faith, but from the sheer exhaustion of fear. Rome was no longer a nation. It was a tomb that could still breathe, and its silence was his greatest victory. By the dawn of 41 CE, Rome was rotting from the inside. The streets were quiet, but beneath the silence, hatred festered. The senators feared him, the priests obeyed him, the people endured him. But within the ranks of his own guard, vengeance was taking shape. Among the Praetorian Guard stood Cassius Chaerea, a veteran soldier, once loyal, now humiliated beyond endurance. Caligula mocked him openly, imitating his voice, forcing him to use obscene phrases during military ceremonies. To the court it was comedy. To Chaerea it was torment. Each insult cut deeper than any blade. In the barracks, whispers turned into plans. Senators desperate to survive joined hands with soldiers desperate for revenge. They would strike when the emperor felt safest within the marble veins of his own palace. The moment came on. January 24th, 41 CE. Caligula was leaving the theatre after yet another grotesque divine performance, surrounded by attendants and guards. He stepped into an underground corridor, his private passage to the palace baths. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of incense. His golden cloak trailed behind him, catching the torchlight. From the shadows, Chaerea stepped forward. "Do you remember me, Caesar?" he said. Caligula turned, smiling faintly, perhaps thinking it was another jest. Then the first blade struck. The emperor staggered, eyes wide in disbelief as the conspirators closed in. 30 wounds followed, steel flashing in the torchlight, the sound of sandals scraping on blood-slick marble. Chaerea's final thrust drove deep into the symbol of all Caligula's crimes, the body part that had ruled his empire through terror and humiliation. The emperor fell to the ground, choking on his own blood, his laurel crown rolling away into the dark. By nightfall, his wife, Milonia Caesonia, and their young daughter, were dead as well. The assassins intended not only to end the man, but to erase his bloodline. Yet as Rome washed the corridors clean, the empire discovered an even darker truth. The tyrant's death did not free them. It revealed the machinery he had built. The ledgers, the decrees, the hierarchies of fear all remained. The empire's bureaucracy had learned to function without him. Caligula had not merely corrupted Rome. He had taught it how to institutionalize cruelty. When the Senate declared his memory damned and ordered his statues destroyed, the marble crumbled, but the system he created endured. Because once power learns to feed on suffering, it no longer needs its master. It only needs silence, and that silence, Rome's final inheritance from Caligula, echoed for centuries.